Good afternoon, and welcome to today's event titled, Does the Supplemental Poverty Measure Provide a More Accurate View of Poverty? My name is Matt Whitinger, and I am the Rowe Scholar in Poverty Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. New poverty figures were released this morning under the government's official poverty measure, as well as the Supplemental Poverty Measure. Those figures show that official poverty rose from 10.5% in 2019 to 11.4% in 2020. Meanwhile, under the supplemental measure, poverty fell significantly from 11.8% in 2019 to 9.1% in 2020. As always with government statistics, there's a lot of detail behind those seemingly contradictory figures. For example, each set of data is sliced and diced by gender, age, race and ethnicity, work, and much more. Current policy discussions here in Washington are heavily focused on reducing child poverty, driven by major expansions in the longstanding child tax credit. Even as we speak, the House Ways and Means Committee is considering legislation to extend the current one-year expansion of that program through 2025 as a down payment on the permanent extension that President Biden and others have called for. But one critical fact often goes unmentioned. Not a penny of prior or currently increased spending on the child tax credit counts under the government's official poverty measure, since those benefits are provided through the tax code. That's not a new development. Before the pandemic, I reviewed federal spending on major means-tested benefit programs in the 2 decades leading up to 2018. What I found was that benefits that didn't count as income under the official poverty measure grew by 146%. Meanwhile, benefits that counted rose by only 9%. The translation? The lion's share of taxpayers' growing efforts to alleviate poverty didn't register, making the official poverty measure increasingly inaccurate. About a decade ago, those weaknesses contributed to the creation of the Supplemental Poverty Measure, which counts tax credits and other uncounted benefits as income. But including those amounts doesn't make the Supplemental Poverty Measure a perfect yardstick of poverty in America. Far from it. As an AEI report this past July reviewed, the measure suffers from its own significant shortcomings. We'll review those shortcomings in today's event, and we are fortunate to have an all-star cast joining us to break down these very complicated issues. Our first speaker is Kevin Corinth, who's the executive director of the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, where his research focuses on poverty and homelessness. Prior to joining the University of Chicago, Kevin served as chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors and as a research fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. Kevin received his BA in economics and political science from Boston College and his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Following Kevin's presentation, we'll have a panel discussion and audience Q&A led by AEI's Angela Rashidi. That discussion should wrap up by around 1 o'clock. A little housekeeping before we begin. We want this to be a two-way conversation, and so we welcome your input in the form of questions that may be posed to our panelists later on. If you have a question you'd like to submit, please send an email to peyton.roth@aei.org, and that appears on your screen, or submit it on Twitter with the hashtag AEI poverty measure. And so with that, Kevin, floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Peyton, once you get my slides up, let me know. Oh, there we go. So thank you, Matt, for having me, and to the American Enterprise Institute for welcoming back for today's event. If you could go to slide 2. So earlier this morning, the Census Bureau reported the official poverty rate for the United States. As Matt mentioned, in 2020, 11.4% of Americans were in poverty, up from the all-time record low of 10.5% reached in 2019. Despite the attention given to these numbers, the official poverty measure suffers from widely recognized flaws. For instance, omitting all in-kind transfers such as food stamps and failing to adjust for taxes. In response to the flaws of the official poverty measure, the Census Bureau began publishing in 2010 its Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM. The Census Bureau reported today that the SPM poverty rate in 2020 was 9.1%. While the SPM makes some improvements over the official poverty measure, it unfortunately suffers from major shortcomings as well. These shortcomings are less widely recognized. The result is that our government-produced poverty estimates tell us little about who is most deprived in the U.S. and how deprivation has changed over time. We think that the success of a society should be judged by how it treats its worst-off members. This is a first-order problem, not just for government statistics, but for how the public and policymakers perceive the success of our society. Next slide. In order to shed light on the shortcomings of the SPM, my co-authors and I published the most comprehensive critical assessment of the SPM to date. Today, I will summarize our findings. The bottom line is that the SPM falls short in meeting the goals of an effective poverty measure. We conclude that better poverty measures are urgently needed. Until then, we are flying in the dark as our policymakers currently debate some of the largest changes to the US safety net in more than half a century. I will first discuss the goals by which we should judge an effective poverty measure, then describe how the SPM is designed and present its shortcomings. I'll conclude by summarizing our proposed solutions. Slide 4. In order to evaluate the efficacy of a poverty measure, we first need to agree on its goals. In our report, we set forth 3 goals that are consistent with previous efforts to improve poverty measurement. First, a poverty measure should identify the most economically deprived individuals in the population. In other words, a person classified as poor should be more deprived than someone classified as not poor. Second, a poverty measure should assess changes in economic deprivation over time. Third, a poverty measure should assess the impact of public policies on economic deprivation. Recent debate on the child tax credit expansion makes this need clear. Slide 5. Before I get into the shortcomings of the SPM, let me provide a high-level summary of how it's designed. Any poverty measure has 2 parts. First, how much income or consumption a family has, and second, a poverty threshold. If a family's income is less than the poverty threshold, then the family is defined as poor. Like the official poverty measure, the SPM includes market income. The SPM improves on the official measure in that it also includes in-kind transfers such as food stamps and adjust for taxes. More controversially, it subtracts certain expenses from income, like childcare and out-of-pocket medical expenses. As we'll get into in the next slide, the SPM, like the official measure, relies solely on self-reported survey data to calculate income. The SPM thresholds are set based on a conception of needs and are updated over time in a complicated way, as I will describe in a few minutes. Thresholds are also adjusted across geographic areas based on differences in spending on housing. I'll now go over some of the main shortcomings of the SPM income measure. Thank you. The first shortcoming of the SPM income measure is that it relies solely on survey data. The problem is that survey respondents don't always provide accurate information about their income. As shown in the figure, surveys capture only 50% of cash welfare, 58% of food stamps, and 67% of unemployment insurance, compared to administrative totals. Surveys understate earnings as well, which further distorts estimates of the taxes families pay. Research from the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project finds that poverty falls by more than 35% when improving the accuracy of surveys by linking them to individual level administrative data. Slide 8. A second shortcoming of the SPM income measure is that it omits the value of health insurance altogether. In 2019, the U.S. spent over $600 billion on Medicaid, which is public health insurance for low-income Americans. That's 10 times the amount spent on food stamps and 6 times the amount spent on refundable tax credits targeted at lower-income families. Given the scale of health insurance and its importance for well-being, ignoring it in a poverty measure is a problem. As a result of these and other shortcomings, the SPM fails at one of the key goals of a poverty measure. The SPM does not identify the most deprived individuals in the population. In fact, the SPM does a worse job in this regard than even the flawed official poverty measure. Here we show 2 examples of ways in which the poor population according to the SPM is better off than the poor population according to the official poverty measure. The poor as identified by the SPM have 8% more consumption and are 7 percentage points more likely to have private health insurance, holding constant the share of the population identified as poor in both measures. These are just 2 of the many dimensions tested in research by Bruce Meyer and Jim Sullivan. For example, they find that compared to the official poor, the SPM poor have more financial assets, have more appliances, and are more likely to own their home. This evidence-based test for evaluating decisions regarding poverty measurement should be used whenever considering proposed improvements. Based on the evidence shown here, the SPM income measure falls short. Now let's turn to the shortcomings of the SPM thresholds. As I noted earlier, a poverty threshold is the level of income below which a family is defined as poor. The higher the threshold, the more people will be defined as poor. Where one sets the poverty threshold is an extremely important decision, reflecting the values of society as to what constitutes a minimally adequate standard of living. But it is critical to recognize that where the poverty line is set is scientifically arbitrary. This view has been shared by many poverty scholars, including Molly Orshansky, the Social Security Administration economist credited with creating the official poverty measures thresholds. In her seminal 1965 paper, she stated, quote, "The measure of poverty thus developed is arbitrary," end quote. Unfortunately, the SPM thresholds cloud their scientific arbitrariness with technical complexity. As shown in the slide, the SPM threshold is set equal to mean spending on food, clothing, shelter, and utilities among families in the 30th to 36th percentile of spending on these items, averaged over the past 5 years, multiplied by 1.2. Of course, all of these decisions are arbitrary. There's no evidence or scientific rationale that justifies the use of the 30th to 36th percentile or to multiply spending by 1.2 as opposed to other values. The overly complex SPM thresholds mislead the public into thinking that the SPM provides a more accurate measure of the level of poverty than the official measure does. For example, a Vox article celebrates the impending release of the SPM poverty rate, writing, quote, "Finally, the public gets to know the correctly measured poverty rate at the same time it finds out the badly measured one." Given the immense value and integrity of our government-produced statistics, it's imperative that the SPM clearly separate value judgments from scientific ones. Slide 12, please. Thank you. As I noted earlier, a key goal of a poverty measure is to assess changes in deprivation over time. For example, much attention is given to the trend in official poverty shown here. Politicians often use this figure to claim we have made little progress in the war on poverty, since it was declared by President Lyndon Johnson in 1963. Of course, how poverty changes over time depends centrally on how thresholds change over time. The two common approaches for updating thresholds each year are to increase them with inflation or to increase them at the same rate as median income. Slide 13. The first common approach for updating thresholds is known as an absolute standard. Thresholds are held fixed in real terms so that we can determine whether families rise above a fixed yardstick. The figure in this slide shows how poverty has changed since the war on poverty was declared in 1963, based on research by Richard Burkhauser and his co-authors. They find, under an absolute standard, and when including all sources of income, the poverty rate fell from President Johnson's 20% baseline in 1963 to less than 2% in 2019. Of course, poverty is much higher today based on modern standards, but the point is that an absolute standard tells us whether people are better off today than they were in the past, based on the standards of the past. The second common approach for updating thresholds is a relative standard, commonly used in European countries. Under this approach, poverty thresholds are increased at the same rate as median income. A relative standard tells us whether income is growing more for lower income families than middle class families. As seen in the figure, we've made much less progress in reducing relative poverty. Unfortunately, the SPM adopts neither an absolute nor relative standard for updating its thresholds. Instead, SPM thresholds are updated with changes in the spending habits of families with moderate levels of spending. If these families reduce their spending one year, the SPM poverty threshold falls as well. And so poverty could fall even if every family in poverty sees no increase in income. The fact that the SPM thresholds are based on a 5-year average of spending makes their interpretation even more difficult. In this way, the SPM fails the second goal of a poverty measure, assessing changes in economic deprivation over time. Slide 14. A third problem with SPM thresholds is that they vary across geographic areas. Places like California and New York City with more spending on housing are assigned higher thresholds than places like Alabama, where spending is lower. All else equal, it makes sense to assign higher thresholds to reflect higher costs in certain areas. However, all else is not equal. Places like California and New York tend to have higher quality schools, better public transportation, and a more pleasant climate in the case of California. Fortunately, we can use evidence to guide our decision. Research from the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project finds that geographically adjusting thresholds leads the SPM to identify a less deprived population as poor, counter to the first goal of a poverty measure. The figure above shows that for the majority of outcomes tested, the poor under a geographically adjusted threshold are better off than the poor when no adjustment is made. If we follow the evidence, we see that geographically adjusting thresholds is counterproductive. You can go to slide 15 and then 16. It's easy to find problems, but in order to move poverty measurement forward, we need practical solutions. Our report proposes solutions to each of the SPM shortcomings. To overcome problems with relying on survey data alone, surveys should be linked to individual level tax and administrative program data to improve the accuracy of income measures. Research from the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project shows how that can be done. To overcome the problem of excluding health insurance, well, the value of health insurance should be included. The report describes how a value of health insurance can be calculated, and it recommends showing the sensitivity of excluding this value from a poverty measure. More broadly, we should use evidence to inform decisions on poverty measurement, especially when the right decision is theoretically ambiguous. Slide 17. In terms of thresholds, we recommend that the SPM adopt a simple baseline threshold. When the SPM is published, it should be made clear that the baseline threshold level, and thus the baseline poverty rate, is scientifically arbitrary. We also recommend that thresholds be updated over time using widely accepted methods. 2 versions of the SPM could be produced, one absolute and one relative. Finally, an evidence-based SPM should not geographically adjust thresholds. Many of our proposed solutions were covered in greater detail by a federal government working group earlier this year. The Interagency Technical Working Group on Evaluating Alternative Measures of Poverty was comprised of technical experts across 11 federal agencies. Their 125-page final report is publicly available on the websites of the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The improved poverty measures they recommend are now in the early stages of development. To conclude, it's important to measure poverty accurately. To do so, we must rely on evidence, and we must keep science and value judgments separate. In doing so, we will do a better job informing the public and policymakers about levels and changes in deprivation in the United States. I'll now turn things over to Angela Rashidi, who will lead a panel discussion on the report. And just to provide a little background on Angela, she is the Senior Fellow and Rose Scholar in Poverty Studies for the American Enterprise Institute, where she studies the effects of federal safety net programs on poverty and income in the United States. Before joining AEI, Dr. Rashidi served as a deputy commissioner in New York City's Department of Social Services, where she oversaw the agency's policy research and program evaluation efforts. Over to you, Angela.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you for your great summary, very compelling. So I have the pleasure of bringing in a very distinguished panel, all experts on poverty and poverty measurement. I'm going to lead a discussion, and then we will have time to address audience questions. As Matt mentioned at the beginning, you can submit questions to Peyton Roth at aei.org, so you can send him an email. Again, that's Peyton Roth at aei.org, or use the Twitter hashtag, hashtag AEI poverty measure. So we will have about 10 minutes at the end, roughly, to address any audience questions. So before we begin, I'm going to bring in our panelists and quickly introduce each of them. Because of the short time that we have, I certainly cannot do justice to all of the expertise that is brought by our panel and fully describe their background. So I encourage all of you to look them up if you are not already familiar with their work. But for a quick introduction, I'm going to first introduce Bruce Meyer. Welcome, Bruce. Bruce is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on poverty, inequality, and social safety net. He is also a professor at the University of Chicago. Bruce's work has been transformational in our understanding of poverty measurement over really the past 2+ decades. And it is really a pleasure to have him here today. We also have with us Richard Burkhauser. Hi, Rich. Rich is also a non-resident senior fellow at AEI, and he teaches at Cornell University as a professor there. Among his many accomplishments, he has been a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and his research on poverty measurement has substantially advanced our knowledge on the implications of different measures. We also have with us Katharine Abraham. Among her many accomplishments, she has also been a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and she has been a commissioner for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Katharine is a distinguished professor at the University of Maryland, where she focuses on the measurement of economic activity. Welcome, Katharine. And finally, we have Marianne Bitler. Marianne is professor of economics at the University of California, Davis, where her research focuses on safety net policy. She has been published extensively about the impact of public policies on various outcomes, including poverty. So welcome, everyone, and thank you all for being here today. All right, so let's get started. So we heard a lot from Kevin, and who really did a great summary of the report, where the authors, including myself, kind of really pointed out some of the flaws of the supplemental poverty measure. The main takeaway really from Kevin's presentation and from that report is that after all these years, all the research, all the deliberations about poverty measurement in the US, we still do not have an effective poverty rate at the federal level. Marianne, I'm going to start with you. I just want to get your reaction to that kind of conclusion. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Kind of tell us your thoughts.
I think the report and the report from the technical working group do a good job of pointing out places where the poverty measure needs to be improved. The supplemental poverty measure could be improved. I may not agree with every point that Kevin made, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to chat about that. But the larger picture that we need a better measure of poverty, I think definitely applies here.
Great, thank you. And Katharine, let me turn to you. Kind of interested in your initial reactions to some of the conclusions in the report. Give us your thoughts.
Sure. There's obviously really a lot in the report. To me, the most important takeaway is the importance of having better data for constructing these measures. I am completely convinced by the work that Bruce and others have done showing that the survey data that we currently rely on for the measurement of poverty is just missing a lot of income. It's missing earned income. It's especially missing transfer income. And that's really a problem for trying to measure poverty. I guess this wouldn't be a discussion if we didn't have some disagreement among ourselves. So just to raise one issue where I think I may be a little less convinced than the authors of the report. I think it's actually rather hard to be sure about whether one measure versus another measure is doing a better job of identifying the population that's truly deprived. So, for example, so the way that evidence is compiled is by looking at a variety of different indicators, like characteristics of the housing of the people who are identified as poor and so on. But I always wonder, why pick this set of measures and not some other measures? So when it comes to looking at housing, there's an indicator for whether the housing unit has a leaky roof. But why isn't there an indicator for the square footage per person of the housing unit? So that's one issue. I'm not sure why it makes sense in evaluating the evidence just to add up all the indicators. If you have multiple indicators related to health, why isn't that just one dimension instead of, if you happen to have a bunch of indicators, you just add them up? And even if you reduce the measures to metrics for different dimensions, why should they all be weighted equally? And then I guess a final concern I have about that approach to identifying the deprived population is that some of these things reflect not access to resources, but decisions that people make. So health, for example, it's partly an issue of access to resources and partly an issue of different people making different decisions. And so I add that all up, and I'm not sure about the conclusion that the supplemental poverty measure does a less good job than some other alternative of measuring the deprived population. And I think that particularly comes up when you're thinking about doing geographic adjustment. Essentially, what a geographic adjustment is doing, adjusting for differences in cost of living, is to count fewer rural people as poor and more urban people as poor. And if you don't have the right metrics for what means that somebody's deprived, then you saying that a geographic adjustment does just less well may not be right. But those are just some initial thoughts.
Great. Great. Thank you, Katharine. Bruce, let me turn it over to you. Maybe first give us a quick reaction, kind of what you heard from Marianne and Katharine. And then I'm going to ask you another question, and then we'll go to Rich.
First of all, thank you, Marianne and Katharine, for your comments. I appreciate that they're mostly supportive of the messages in the AEI report and then the working group report. I do think the process of evaluating whether or not a poverty measure is an improvement over another measure is not simple. And I can see that there are many different indicators that you could look at, and we emphasize that in our work. Basically, we tend to try and look at every indicator that's available. And it just happens that in the case of the comparison of OPM to SPM, or consumption poverty measure to the SPM, almost every indicator goes in the direction of suggesting that the SPM does not do a good job of characterizing who is poor. And that also, you see with the geographic adjustment, that it's not, we're not picking and choosing our indicators here. We're taking everything that we have available and seeing that they all point in the same direction, suggesting that those who essentially all point in the same direction, and we count them up just to have a way of summarizing a very broad set of evidence. I do agree that there are some tricky things in just looking at indicators of well-being to evaluate differences between poverty measures, because one striking pattern that you find is those who are recipients of benefits tend to be worse off than other people with approximately the same income. And you generally, one of the points that the SPM emphasizes, that we emphasize, is that you want to count the benefits that the government provides to reduce poverty. And we believe that the fact that those individuals are worse off just reflects the good targeting of most anti-poverty programs.
Great. Let me actually pull in Rich, and then I'm going to go back to you, Bruce. But so Rich, one thing that really struck me from today's presentation, if folks were able to watch the Census Bureau's presentation, is they really kind of made a point of emphasizing that the supplemental poverty measure, a rate, was lower for the first time than the official poverty measure. And that really speaks to kind of this arbitrary nature of the threshold. So I just kind of want to get your thoughts, because I've heard you talk about this before, but just give us your thoughts on the threshold issue that Kevin very well summarized, but the threshold issue and the problems created by having this arbitrary threshold.
Right. I think that one of the problems for people who are trying to get a handle on what's going on in the measurement of poverty is that they tend to think that institutions who generate numbers must be right. And one of the unfortunate things about the history of the poverty measure is that people haven't carefully distinguished those things that economists are really helpful in advising the policy side people about poverty. So we can say a great deal about the income distribution. I think between the five of us, or the four of us here, we could probably come up with a reasonable set of sources of income that should be in an income measure. And we could come up with a data set that was reasonable in looking at those measures. And since Bruce is here, he would argue that, hey, why not look at consumption? And we could all agree that, yeah, that's a good idea too. And we could do a distribution of consumption. And we could work together, and there's been lots of research on finding out what these distributions are. So that's good news about what economists can do. They also are pretty good at thinking about conceptually how to change thresholds over time. And there's a literature in Europe which uses a relative poverty measure, which simply arbitrarily chooses 0.5 or 0.6 or 0.7 of the median as the threshold, and then sees how that changes over time. It's really simple, it's precise, it's arbitrary, but it's easily understandable. And we have a relative poverty measure, and in thinking about how it changes over time, we have an absolute poverty measure, and in thinking about how it changes over time, that means we hold the real value of those goods and services constant in real terms over time. And there's going to be some disagreement with us with regard to whether we use a CPIU or whether we use the chain measure that Katharine happily was in BLS to give us, or we use some other thing. There's a tremendous amount of unity in the profession in looking at those two issues. I would argue that the initial level of the poverty thresholds is scientifically arbitrary. I can't come up with a valid justification for any number as an economist, but it's policy relevant. And Lyndon Johnson in 1963 told his Council of Economic Advisors, hey, I want to do a war on poverty. What about 20%? And they said, oh, well, if you want to do 20%, here's the distribution and here's the threshold so to get it to you. Now, I wasn't in the room when that happened, but my guess is that's probably what happened, because that's kind of what happened when President Trump was talking to us as Council of Economic Advisors. He had a policy and he wanted us to give him some facts that would allow that policy to go forward. So I have no problem with a poverty threshold that is policy relevant based on whatever the policymakers want it to be. And our job should be to do it well in terms of getting the best data, using the best concepts to do it, but to then sort of look at the supplementary poverty measure, which is based on one bunch of arbitrary decisions about where the threshold should be, and compare it with the President Johnson's official poverty measure, which is based on a bunch of others, is not very relevant unless you ask yourself, how much do you, which one of those measures do you think is has been more consistent over time? So in a particular year, I don't look at anything. What I would look at is if you start at the thresholds at with the same population, and how that changed over time, then that's something that economists can say something about. It's shocking to me that the supplementary poverty measure is given so much reverence by the press, but also by my fellow colleagues. I mean, can you really justify the thresholds in the supplementary poverty measure? I haven't heard anybody who actually can say it with a straight face, but please tell me if you can do it.
Well, actually, thank you for that, Rich. Actually, let's turn to Marianne. I mean, I'm just curious, kind of building off of that. I mean, you've obviously extensively studied the impact of safety net programs on various outcomes. Like, do you share some of the same concerns Rich has with the quasi-relative thresholds of the SPM?
I don't disagree that it is hard to come up with a justification for the partially relative and partially absolute way in which that is created. And obviously the underlying data sources are not very, some of the reason for some of the weaknesses like averaging over time are related to small samples and the like. I agree, however, I think with Katharine that having uniform levels across the country might not make the most sense. I live in California. Certainly, there's an argument that prices reflect amenities, but certainly there's an argument that other things affect prices, particularly for housing in California. There's a particular law called CEQA that I think many people would like to get rid of in order to sort of enable more housing to be built. And I would also just say, I think any call for sort of improvements in the poverty measure can't be made without improving access to the data and implementing the stuff from the Evidence-Based Policy Act that Bruce helped to get put into place along with a bunch of other people, and also having infrastructure and expertise within the various statistical agencies in order to implement the changes that we want to have.
Yep. Good point. So before turning to the income side of the poverty measure, Katharine, did you want to share any thoughts on the threshold side? Any additional thoughts on the threshold and kind of the quasi-relative nature? Like, are you comfortable with that?
No, I from when the National Academy's report came out in the mid-90s that sort of recommended moving in this direction, I've been uncomfortable with that. But I mean, the issue, of course, is that and Kevin sort of alluded to this, that our ideas about what's a minimal acceptable standard of living change over time. I think what I would rather do is periodically update the benchmark, if you will. So you could have a measure that started with the 2010 standard of living and move forward from there. And then in 2020, you could introduce another measure that started at that standard of living, and maybe you could keep the old one going too. But that would let you both look at changes over time and also have a measure that in terms of the level of poverty was arguably more meaningful in terms of the current reality.
Right.
So can I just respond to that?
Yep.
Katharine has just mouthed Bob Lampman, who was the actual creator of the poverty measure, and in his book in 1971, in which he argues for exactly that let's start out with an absolute poverty measure. I predict that in 10 years, we will probably be so successful in that we'll need to rethink this, and let's go forward. And in fact, if you look at a paper I happen to have written, you will see that statement made. I don't understand why it's so hard for some of my colleagues in this profession to say what you've just said. I find it amazing, but no one will publish our paper, so clearly they don't like what we're talking about.
Right. Well, we'll see if that starts to change a little bit, right, Rich? Bruce, I want to turn to you. I mean, obviously you can comment on the threshold as well, but I really wanted to bring you in to talk about the income side of the measure. And I was also struck by some of the media reports that were out immediately after the release this morning. And it all pointed to the benefits of the stimulus payment and unemployment to some extent, but really the stimulus payment. So for those of us that understand how the measure is put together, that's not surprising because the stimulus payments are largely imputed. But I think that it really underestimates the impact of unemployment insurance and SNAP. And Bruce, I want you to really tell us why would that be of a concern, and what kind of is the SPM missing that we should be concerned about?
So first, I do want to again agree with Katharine that I really like her statement of how we should adjust thresholds over time. And as Rich said, that's exactly how Robert Lampman put it, and he is characterized at times as the intellectual architect of the war on poverty. So let me get to why we actually want to change the SPM and why it matters, and that gets to Angela's question. So one of the key values of the SPM is that it's easier to use it to figure out what was the poverty reducing effect of various programs. And the report that came out today indicates that the stimulus payments reduced poverty by 12 percentage points and unemployment insurance by 6 percentage points. And that's an important use of the SPM, but I suspect it got things pretty badly wrong in that it's saying that the effect of the stimulus was more than twice the effect of unemployment insurance, even though unemployment insurance was better targeted at those who lost income in the pandemic and those who are lower income, because stimulus payments went to people earning more than $200,000 a year. We know that the survey that is used to construct the SPM dramatically understates certain transfers. And we know that that's gotten worse over time. The numbers that Kevin reported had about 30% of unemployment insurance not reported in the current population survey. Our numbers from 2010 show about 40%. And the latest numbers that I am seeing from last year are saying 60% of the $600 billion that we paid out in unemployment insurance, 60% wasn't reported, wasn't recorded in the survey. So we dramatically understate the poverty reduction of certain programs, and that has implications for us understanding how effective different programs are relative to others. We spent last year more than twice as much on unemployment insurance than stimulus. And as I said, it was better targeted, so it's quite peculiar that the poverty reduction was less than half as much as indicated by the SPM. And I suspect that that's wrong. Other programs have their poverty reduction sharply understated: SNAP, SSI, the Earned Income Tax Credit. So we get bad information about how effective our programs are using the SPM as currently constructed. We also get a distorted impression of who is the most disadvantaged. So this year, the numbers indicated that under the SPM, that the poverty rate of the elderly was higher than others. And we know from work done by people at Census, B and Mitchell, that there's sharp underreporting of pensions in the current population survey. Their estimate was that poverty was overstated by about 3 percentage points because of just this problem. So the SPM gives us incorrect information about who we should focus on targeting for our anti-poverty efforts.
Thank you for that, Bruce. Does anybody on the panel disagree with that point about the inadequate use of survey data for the income and the need
I completely agree with that point. It's very clear that the survey that we're relying on just doesn't do a very good job of capturing all of the relevant income. And I think we have to move in the direction of using more administrative data.
Well, and so I guess that's my next question, because I mean, it does seem like there's generally a consensus. I mean, I think the Census Bureau has even said that. But so how does that happen? Like, what needs to happen to finally get that piece fixed? Anybody? Bruce, I know you've worked on this, but anybody else, Bruce or others?
I think it's really important that further actions be taken to make sure that states have to share data with the federal government for the programs. I do a lot of work, as you well know, Angela, on food assistance programs, and many states do not share their data, and USDA's opinion in the past was the data belonged to the states and the states had to sign on in order to share the data. And it seems really quite hard to imagine that states are going to be willing to share all of the components that go into the SPM without some additional reason to do this. And so it might take some action from elsewhere beyond just the data agencies. But I think it's really important. But I also think, we also want timely measures. And, you can't, I don't think states have the capacity right now to share measures from what happened last year in order to create a measure of poverty right now. So I also think there is ongoing need for, if we want to have timely measures, some kind of self-reports and research that sort of correlates them. But I 100% agree that we need more of this administrative data, and it's going to probably take more action than has been taken already.
Yeah. Particularly in cases where the federal government is providing funding to the states, I think there's a completely legitimate reason for the federal government deciding to say, states, you need to report these data.
Mm-hmm. And Bruce, any feedback? Even though I'm moderating, but I worked in New York City for a while, and one of the issues there with sharing data with the federal government at the state level was there was actually a law at the state level about not sharing data due to privacy issues. So it would have just created this whole loop of changing state law and then changing regulations at the agency level. And so, Bruce, I know you've worked with states. Do you see those kind of issues as being the most prominent?
I think Marianne and Katharine have highlighted one of the most important areas for work going forward, and that's sharing of state data, usually for programs that the federal government largely funds, with the sharing those data with the federal government. And that was a key recommendation of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking that Katharine Abraham led. There was unanimous support for that idea. That would go a long way in not only improving poverty measurement, but improving our ability to evaluate many of the programs that are important in reducing poverty.
Great. Okay, one quick question before we turn over to audience questions, because I have seen a few come in. The other thing I noticed this morning listening to the US Census Bureau's presentation is they first presented, when they got to the poverty section, the official poverty measure. And as I was watching, I just kept thinking, like, this is just, it feels almost meaningless when they were presenting it. And so I'm just curious, and maybe Rich, we'll start with you. Do you feel like the official poverty measure is just maybe obsolete? And what should be done about that?
Well, I think it's really important to have a public measure of the well-being of the left tail of the income distribution or the consumption distribution. So I don't want to have nothing, because you need a number to beat a number. But we really do need to go. I think that the supplementary poverty measure is not the vehicle to move forward with. That's the kind of revolutionary statement I would make. I think we need to rethink this, go back to the issues that the Lantman group put together in the first place. I think we now have much better data on income and consumption. We can be more, we don't have to have this complexity that, this SPM is really the work of a committee. So they went after a racehorse and created a camel. Let's get rid of the camel. Let's get back to the basic fundamentals of what it is we're looking for. The last two things that we talk about are the threshold issues, and I think you can go with a relative and an absolute, and we should do that. I agree with Marianne and others. Let's think about doing both of them and think about what Lantman talked about in the original. Let's do a absolute for every year, and a relative, and it's at some point decide when we want to change that again. So it's important to have a number and to be able to talk about policy. But if it can't be used to look at what the effects of actual programs are, then it's worse than nothing, particularly if people believe it. I think that's the problem. Now, the good news is, and Katharine, thank you very much for working with Ron Haskins on that. I think there is general consensus in government, amazingly, on, at least in lip service, to getting good data. So the will probably is there. My concern, to be honest with you, is I think the agencies hold the data closely. There's issues of cross-agency cooperation, let alone states to federal. So somebody needs to figure out how to make that work. That's not me, but that's what needs to happen.
Great. Any other thoughts on that point?
I do think that there have been some cooperative actions, like bringing some of the USDA data into the Census Bureau and linking it with the other sources, but certainly it can't hurt to have more pressure, to have more cooperation.
Great. All right, great. Well, I'm going to turn to audience questions. And so let's maybe also pull Kevin back in here. Hi, Kevin. And so a reminder for any additional questions, feel free to email peytonroth@aei.org or use Twitter, #AEI Poverty Measure. So we do have some questions coming in. I actually think I want to start with the health insurance question because this has been somewhat, well, it is controversial. So the question that came in, and I'm going to read it and then like kind of let whoever wants to respond, but maybe try to interpret the question a little bit. But when considering whether to include the value of health insurance as income in a poverty measure, is it important to consider that families don't always spend their health insurance, in quotes, money in the same way as income? And I think that's a really good question. Like, should we be thinking about health insurance coverage the same way as we think of it as other income? Maybe, who wants to start? Maybe Bruce or Kevin?
Kevin, do you want to go ahead or?
Sure. I mean, I think there's real issues there. Certainly, health insurance is huge. It's $600 billion in spending. If we include that as a resource for very low-income people, it will become, for some, perhaps the majority of their resources. So I think there's things you can think about to deal with that. You may say for lower income people, you may adjust downward the value people place on it. But ignoring it, I guess I would say, is not the solution. Certainly there's research that health insurance does improve people's well-being, reduces financial hardship. And so to exclude that altogether is certainly the wrong approach.
I think your comment sort of hinted how the SPM ended up in looking like it did. I mean, the simple alternatives would be just count the value of health insurance or don't count it. And I think what you're saying is, well, it's kind of complicated, so we need to do something that's a little, we need to adjust the numbers in some way. I mean, I just would make the point that you can't feed your kids health insurance. So I mean, it's resources that are available for a very specific purpose. And so you certainly wouldn't want to say that somebody who had a really good health insurance plan and nothing else wasn't for it.
So let me go on the other side on that and say that you certainly can't eat health insurance, but you can't value it at zero either. Or are we saying that all the money spent on health insurance is completely worthless and we should therefore spend it in some other way? We have to count it in some way.
Right. I guess I'm agreeing in some sense with what Kevin said and what Angela said, that it's complicated.
I think that this is one of the thorniest issues in poverty measurement. And it's clear that the evidence is that many people with very low incomes at the poverty line or below aren't willing to pay for health insurance at the cost that Medicaid is provided. the cost that goes into providing Medicaid or other health insurance programs. But both Kevin and I did analyses. Kevin looking at an income poverty measure. I was looking at a consumption poverty measure, and the share of the number of people who would have a very large share of their income attributed to health insurance was very small when you incorporated the full value or full cost of health insurance in a poverty measure. Now, I think worrying about the case where someone would have all or most of their income coming from an imputed value of health insurance isn't, that wouldn't be that common. But still, I can see that one way to prevent that from happening is to cap health insurance as a share of total income or spending, so that just couldn't happen. But I don't think that kind of restriction would likely be binding that often if you imposed it.
Great. So another question came in about another controversial part of the measure, which is housing. And so maybe I'll ask Kevin, just can you quickly, although I know it's not a straightforward question, but how are people treated differently depending on their housing situations in the SPM?
Sure. So, and this is in our report too, but it was a little too wonky for the presentation. But basically, there's 3 groups of housing tenure types: homeowners who have paid off their mortgage, homeowners who have not yet paid off their mortgage, and renters. And essentially, there's a separate threshold set for each of those different groups. I mean, the purpose behind it is sensible, which is that we want to ensure that we sort of account for the fact that homeowners, say without a mortgage, sort of get value from that housing, and they don't have to pay rent. And that's not captured by the SPM resource measure. So it's sort of a workaround to deal with that. I mean, what we suggest in the report, that the way you really want to do this is to have the same consistent threshold across all housing groups, but you want to include sort of the value that people have from their owned home, sort of the flow value of home or home ownership. And so that does require additional either survey questions or more research to implement.
And just quickly, Katharine and Marianne, I'm just curious your thoughts. I know you both kind of mentioned that you feel like the geographic adjustments might be appropriate. Do you feel like the way housing is treated is appropriate, or would you like to see some changes there?
I think it would be helpful to have some changes, but I also think, in the same way that you can't eat your health insurance, it's a little hard to buy food with the imputed flow value of your housing. And I think that's something to keep in mind.
And just as a data issue, we've talked quite a bit about the difficulty of collecting information in a survey on some of these income sources. I shudder to think about the difficulty of collecting accurate survey information about the value of people's imputed owner-occupied rent. That as a practical matter, although it's a little kludgy, what the SPM does with housing tenure may be the best solution, though looking at it would be appropriate.
Great. All right, I think we have time for one more question from the audience, and this is actually kind of a policy-related question, but related to how we measure poverty. So the question is, how might a relative versus absolute poverty measure guide the policies we pursue, especially when it comes to safety net policies and redistribution? And I would just add to that and then kind of throw it out to the group, because there has been some suggestions that we should move to a fully relative measure like many European countries do. How would that affect policymaking in your opinion?
I'm happy to jump in. I think relative and absolute poverty measures serve different purposes. And we want probably both type measures. The absolute measure tells you how living standards at the bottom have changed over time. And the relative measure tells you about inequality. And we care about both. They're different things, and we want both for different purposes.
There's thought. I hear a lot of shaking heads. I'm just curious, and not to be disparaging to our elected officials at all, but do you think they're sophisticated enough to understand kind of the differences between those?
Well, I think Lyndon Johnson was smart enough not to choose a relative poverty measure as a success of the poverty programs he was proposing. So I think they're pretty smart. And I think that a politician sure as heck would want to simply say, hey, I'm going to make you better off at the bottom. And they wouldn't want to say necessarily, judge me on whether you do better than the middle class. That strikes me as not a winning strategy.
Great. All right. Well, that is all the time we have, everyone. I just want to thank our panelists again so much for your insight this afternoon. Kevin, thank you again for your presentation. Reminder to the audience, our report is available at aei.org. And yeah, thanks everybody. Have a great day.